In a mechanical way, reacting to external demands or instruction rather than in ways determined by his own interests and energies and power. He says we may admire what he does, but we despise what he is. For Humboldt, then, man is born to inquire and create. And when a man or a child chooses to inquire or create out of his own free choice, then he becomes in his own terms an artist rather than a tool of production or a well-trained parent.
Hello and welcome to the 121st episode of the Diet Soap Podcast. This is a podcast that sees and wants to seize the late capitalist moment. On Diet Soap, we consider what it would mean to occupy everything and attempt to realize philosophy. The guest this week is Brendan Cooney, and we'll be finishing off the second part of our conversation about crisis theory and three Marxist thinkers. We discuss David Harvey, Rick Wolff, and Andrew Kliman. There's also an interesting conversation about the role of theory in politics and the need for political movements. A conversation that seems dated to me now, just a few weeks later, now that Occupy Wall Street has found its legs. It's Monday, October 10th, and I'm Douglas Lane, the host of this podcast. A couple of points of interest at the start here. The show has moved to Mondays because I found part-time work with the Oregon Symphony, and we'll have to put the shows together on the weekends. Diet Soap has been on hiatus for the past few weeks, but I want to thank Andrew M., Peter L., Michael T., David B., and Bruce P. and for donating. I also want to say to Baba Femi, thank you for encouraging me to get back and for listening. It's great to get so much support, even though the podcast was shut down due to technical difficulties. My old iMac died just before Steve Jobs shed his mortal coil, but now I've got a little Mac Mini. What I'd really like is a Linux machine made out of recycled wood and spit, and that would upgrade itself using nanotechnology. Anybody know where I can find one of those for the price of an iPad? Anyhow, copies of Pick Your Battle are still available through the end of this month, and Bruce P. and Peter L. will be receiving copies of my surrealist memoir soon. The other donors had already received copies. In other news, a few things have happened since the last podcast. I mentioned Occupy Wall Street at the start, and I have to say that while I was skeptical about that movement as it was described by Adbusters over the summer, I have seen it transform itself and think it's getting stronger and support Occupy Wall Street. At the end of this episode, Cooney comments that there is no movement of radicals who could use and transform radical theory. And that might have seemed true when he said it a month or so ago, but it may not be true anymore. We'll see. I'd promised to include excerpts from my upcoming novella, Wave of Mutilation, on the podcast until I'd finished reading the whole story. And I'll return to doing that, but in an effort to get this podcast out the door, I'm skipping that segment this week. The music you're listening to is El Cholo by Tosco Tango, which is the theme from the Linklater film Waking Life. In just a moment, you'll be listening to Brendan Cooney and I discuss three Marxists.
Well, basically, the underconsumptionist idea is that starting in the late 70s, or that workers, although they worked harder and were more productive, and as productivity rose through the decades, that their wages remained stagnant. And this meant that there wasn't enough demand in the economy to buy back all the things that workers were making. And this leads to an overproduction problem. Those products can only be bought through consumer credit instead of through wages. So the capitalist class was actually making money, lending workers money in order to buy back the things the workers were making. This led to increasing financialization of the economy, increasing speculative bubbles, and those bubbles eventually burst. Like you said, with the last argument, this picture resonates very well with a lot of our lived experience in capitalism, because we know that people have been working harder and longer hours for less money, and working 2 jobs, and having less benefits and less pensions than our parents did. We know that everyone's been sustaining their standard of living through ridiculous amounts of credit. And so these are all like real things that we can, latch onto. And so I think people are very, find this explanation appealing because it describes very simply a lot of our lived experience.
But it explains the crisis. What's interesting to me about Wolff's explanation is that it's actually the success of the capitalist class that's brought on the crisis, the increase in profits. I mean, he talks about how this is, in a very dramatic way, he talks about how this has been a period of enormous profits for the capitalist class, something that we've never seen in history before. That they're, I'm sorry, I'm trying to do my Rick Wolff.
Yeah, sounds good. It was a good impression.
So that's very different from the falling rate of profit theory. I mean, he's actually saying profits have been increasing,
right,
and that's led to crisis, right?
So there's a whole debate there between whether profits rose or fell during the neoliberal period, and maybe I could just briefly sort of talk people through that debate. Basically, it comes down to how you measure profit rates. One of the common ways to measure profit rates is you measure the current amount of money you've made, your current revenues, over the current cost of all of your capital, your means of production, basically, your factories. How much do your factories and machines cost you this year, and then related to how much money you've made, right? It seems like a fair version of the profit rate. Well, those value of machines and factory are falling every year. Your factories are losing value every year, and all your machines are deteriorating and devaluing every year. How do you measure their value when you're calculating profits? Do you measure the amount of money you actually paid for them? Or do you measure what they're worth in the market right now? Now,
clearly, I mean, you have to measure what you paid for them.
Right. If you measure what they are worth in the market right now, then your profit rate is a lot higher than if you measure what they were worth when you paid for them. These are the two different. Now, for someone like Wolff, and for a lot of people, when they talk about this huge spike in profits over the neoliberal period, they're talking about a current cost rate of profit based on the current prices of your expenses. When Kliman talks about the profit rate falling, he's basing his figures on an historical cost measurement of the rate of profit. And then there are these very throwdown debates happening in obscure academic papers over the past few years about which of these ways of measuring the profit rate is better. Which one adjusts for inflation more, which one blah, 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 blah more, and it's kind of a confusing world to wade into.
It just seems to me so obvious that you have to take your initial investment and compare it to what you're making. I mean, you can financialize your way out of some of this problem. You can innovate and buy new equipment now, but you're still paying off the debt, right? So you're always going to have to, I mean, look, if you buy a house, you're paying a mortgage, and the price of the value of your house drops to way lower, that's a problem for you.
Yeah,
right. So it just seems to me kind of hit you over the head obvious that you have to calculate profits based on initial investment rather than whatever the value of the equipment is now.
Right. Right.
And you explained that it can get very complicated, and that there are lots of reasons I probably have no understanding of why people would make an argument against that. But are you sure that Wolff is actually making what, to me anyway, it looks like such an obvious mistake when he does under consumption?
I can't talk super authoritatively about Wolff because I haven't read a lot of his stuff. I have read a lot of debates between there's a French man named Michael Husson, who is sort of the person who's debated with Andrew Kliman the most in this issue. And the debates get pretty technical, and they're hard to follow, and they're hard to remember after you've read them. You think you've understood them. But a lot of back and forth about which measurement of the profit rate best captures different phenomena like inflation and devaluation and all sorts of other things. I think that Andrew Kliman's point is, and the point you just made is a pretty obvious, intuitive point that I find hard to refute, that if, like you said, if I was going to measure my profit on one of my investments, I'd measure it on the amount of money I initially spent, not the amount of money my capital was worth today. And two, that it makes, if you look at Andrew Kliman's charts of the rate of profit, you know how I said one of these distinctive features of a neoliberal period is that stagnation was accumulating. That accumulation was stagnating. And so, if Rick Wolff is claiming the profit rate is going up, but new investments in production are stagnating, this is a really strange phenomenon that's never happened before. It has to be explained. It can only be explained through these sort of like contingent historical institutional features of neoliberalism, like this was the new philosophy of the neoliberal period, or there was just sort of this new fascination with financial speculation or something, or it was just like David Harvey, it was sort of this political project of the capitalist class to just screw workers over and not bother with actually investing in production because they realized they could just get rich through speculation and finance and seizing assets from people. If you look at Andrew Kliman's graphs, actually the profit rate and the rate of accumulation pretty much track each other. So the fact that accumulation has stagnated is just totally a corollary of the fact that the rate of profit is stagnated. So that he explains the fact he doesn't need to have recourse to these institutional explanations to explain stagnation. It's just right there in his theory of the rate of profit.
They tell you we are dreamers. The true dreamers are those who think things can go on indefinitely the way that they are. We are not dreamers. We are the awakening from a dream which is turning into a nightmare. We are not destroying anything. We are only witnessing how the system is destroying itself. We all know the classic scenes from cartoons. The cart reaches a precipice, but it goes on walking, ignoring the fact that there is nothing beneath it. Only when it looks down and notices it, it falls down. This is what we are doing here. We are telling the guys there on Wall Street, hey, look down.
So has the falling rate of profit, I mean, you gave an historical account of this at the beginning, but has this theory always had such hard times? I mean, at one point it was the orthodox Marxist.
Actually, no.
No?
So in Marx, if you read Marx, the only theory of crisis that we really get is the theory of the falling rate of profit. It's in Volume 3 of Capital. But for one thing, Volume 3 of Capital was never finished and was edited and released by Engels after Marx died. And a lot of people will say that a lot of things in there are not fully fleshed out and worked out. It is a working draft. And I think, having read it, that's probably the case for a lot of it. But in the Second International, so the group of people in the early 1900s that were following the Marxist tradition, actually the underconsumption theory was the dominant theory of crisis. And the falling rate of profit was sort of marginalized at that point. In the crisis of the 70s in the U.S., and the global crisis in the 70s, the theory of the falling rate of profit sort of had a resurgence of interest in it. And different people from different parts of the Marx world became sort of advocates of re-examining, rediscovering this theory of Marx's.
Right. And revising. They were Marxist revisionists.
Yeah, exactly. Revising unfortunately, a lot of what we think of as orthodox Marxism comes from this Second International, which was in many ways, I think, didn't have Marx right. I mean, that's my whole take on the subjective-objective value debate, is that they didn't quite have Marx right when they were defending him.
Right. Okay. So my next question may be too hard for you to answer, but I mean, why? To me, I mean, you sold me on this. I think I'm more confident stating this stuff than you are now. You know, because I'm so ignorant about it. So confident, but I'm sold on this. It seems like a very good theory to me. What makes it so difficult, and why aren't we hearing about the falling rate of profit, except from you and Kliman and the Marxist humanists now? Is that tough? Is that too big?
I don't know. And it's not just. I mean, there are a group of. I mean, there are lots of different people. Not lots, but there are different people who are fans of the falling rate of profit theory, and they're not all on the same page in the Marx world. There's a man named Michael Roberts who has a blog. There's this guy named Guillermo Carcadi. I don't know if I'm saying his name right. Who just came out with a book about the falling rate of profit. Alan Freeman. And none of them are all sort of in the same political group or from necessarily the same academic tendencies. But yeah, it's definitely not as. I mean, I think one of the reasons it's not as popular an explanation is because it really relies on Marx's value theory to communicate to people, and that involves a lot of prior knowledge that most people don't have. Whereas Rick Wolff can give a whole lecture on under consumption theory and not use the word value at all in the lecture.
Right.
David Harvey's recent book, Enigma of Capital, doesn't have the word value in it once. Right. And he can, and it makes their works confusing, right? Because David Harvey's talking about 3% compound growth and a surplus accumulation problem, but you're left wondering, what's it a surplus of that's over accumulating? And 3% compound growth of what? 3% of physical products, of capital measured in just money terms? You know, like what exactly is it they're talking about? There's sort of a vagueness, but I think the vagueness is because they're trying to appeal to popular audiences.
Right.
Right. It's hard to do that with the falling rate of profit because you're immediately talking about the fact that only labor can produce value, and you're already referencing a lot of Marxian language.
Yeah, so it's partly just because capitalism is so triumphant that the labor theory of value and the falling rate of profit are hard to communicate. Then.
Yeah, because ideologically people don't have necessarily the tools to lay audience to dissect these things. I think it's still an accessible theory, just requires a little bit more. That's one of the reasons. I don't know I'm sure there are other reasons, just dealing with all sorts of contingent factors.
This video doesn't have all the bells and whistles my last one did, but it's going to be pretty exciting anyway. In fact, I'm really excited about it. It's going to tie together a lot of things I've been talking about. And it's going to answer the question, what is capitalism? In a lot of my videos I've talked about exploitation, obviously. And in my recent video on money, I talked a lot about how money itself embodies lots of contradictions. Today I'm going to talk about how capitalism, through exploitation, solves some of the basic contradictions within money. Barter is a simple system of commodity exchange in which people trade one commodity for another. We can represent this with the diagram C and C, that's commodity trading for another commodity. As trading grows and there are more and more commodities to be traded, societies began to develop money. Money can be any universally desired commodity with a stable value, so silver, gold, axes, cattle. What makes money different from other commodities is the fact that it can be exchanged for any commodity. So now, instead of having C to C, commodity to commodity, we have CMC, commodity, money, commodity. Both types of exchange existed side by side for a long time before CMC began to dominate. The establishment of money as a universal equivalent, that is, a commodity which can buy anything, gives money status as the ultimate form of social power. People then can be tempted to hoard money, not for the sake of buying commodities, but just for the sake of having more money. Not only does money create this temptation, but it also requires some process where money is hoarded sometimes and then injected back into circulation at other times. This is because we need to have just the right amount of money in circulation to represent the values of all the commodities that are being traded, CMC, at any given time. Commodity production is erratic. If we don't have just the right amount of money in circulation, commodities either can't circulate at all, or they circulate with erratic prices. The only way to solve this problem is to take money out of circulation when it's not needed, and then inject it back in when it is needed. So with money, there's both the possibility and the need for some MCM, some process which circulates money just for the sake of circulating money. But why would someone want to trade money for money? This only makes sense if they're making more money from the trade. In CMC, people are trading with money one commodity for another commodity because they have a use for the other commodity. In simple commodity production, people are exchanging these uses or use values with one another through money. But the purpose of MCM isn't to trade use values at all, but to get a greater quantity of the same thing, money. Instead of being qualitative, it's a quantitative process. So how do you get more money? With CMC, exchange only happens if people agree to trade things for equal value. People measure the value of commodities with money and exchange them for money. If I sell something I've made for $10 and then go spend that $10 on stuff, I'm essentially trading $10 of my labor for $10 of somebody else's labor. An equal exchange has taken place with the aid of money as a measure of value. The value that is being measured corresponds to the amount of labor that's gone into making both commodities. But if we're going to do MCM, money, commodities, money, we need an unequal exchange. We need to end up with more money than we started with. How is that possible? Well, I could sell a commodity for more than it's worth. That is, more than its labor value. What happens when I do that? This can only work if I have a monopoly on selling this commodity, because if I'm selling for more than it's worth, other people can just undersell me. If I do have a monopoly, I can count on the fact that I won't have a monopoly forever. When one person profits from an unequal exchange, it attracts other people into that industry. Soon, there are competitors all trying to undersell each other, eating away at the profit margin until the product trades at its value again. This is exactly what the early merchant class was all about. Savvy traders traversed the globe looking for bargains, trying to find cultures willing to part with their pelts, spices, jewels, and gold for less so they could return home with commodities and sell them for more. And when they couldn't find unequal exchanges, they made them in the form of theft. The early merchant class was rife with pirates who made a living from stealing commodities in order to sell them. The other class that mastered MCM early on was the money-lending class. By lending money to people and then charging them interest on the loan, the money-lending class could turn a profit. This was called usury, and it was frowned upon at many times in history, even outlawed. It should be pointed out that neither merchant capital or usury actually created more value. They merely took commodities from one place and moved them to another place. But this moving of commodities was such a source of wealth that it pushed traders and loaners to the farthest corners of the universe in search of profit. And so the world was slowly brought together by merchants exploring the world looking for unequal exchanges to get rich off of. But whenever merchants pushed to the borders of the economic universe, they found that the economic integration they had spawned had gone and created their worst nightmare: equal exchange. As cultures were brought into closer contact, as people began to find out how much things exchanged for in different places, as more and more merchants began traveling the same Silk Roads, it was harder and harder to find people to rip off. And so, those who lived by unequal exchange had to find new ways to make profit. They began to ask, what if there was a magic commodity, a commodity which could produce more value than it cost to buy? They found such a commodity. It was human labor. When I sell the products of my own labor on the market, I get all the money myself. But what if I'm selling my labor to someone else? If I sell my labor to a capitalist for a wage, the capitalist can pay less for my wage than he sells the commodity for. Thus he transfers the inequality of profit in exchange into the production process. Let's take a closer look. When I sell something I've made myself on the open market, I'm selling a commodity. When I sell my labor to someone else, I'm selling my labor power. That is my capacity to do work. How much I produce is subject to how hard I work, the quality of the tools and the materials I use, and the organization of the workplace. I'm paid by the hour, so the harder I work, the more I can produce per hour. Thus, the amount of money I'm paid doesn't necessarily correspond to the amount of value I produce. In fact, if it did, the capitalist wouldn't be able to make a profit at all, and would therefore have no reason to engage in MCM in the first place. This, then, is what capitalists do. They profit from inequality in the sphere of production instead of inequality in the sphere of exchange. They're modern-day pirates. Why are workers willing to work for less than the value of what they produce? Well, wages, instead of being related to the value of commodities workers produce, are related to the amount of money necessary to reproduce the worker. This is a fancy term for what it takes to get the worker to show up to work the next day. This usually means paying a worker enough for rent, food, entertainment, and whatever else the general standard of living in a society requires. This cost of reproducing the worker varies from place to place over time as the standard of living adjusts to the whims of capitalist development. For instance, the standard of living for most Americans has fallen in the last 30 years, making labor cheaper for capitalists to buy. But it still doesn't explain why workers consent to this. After all, they choose to work for a wage rather than simply produce goods themselves. Well, many people do choose to work for themselves if they can. In fact, as real wages have fallen in the American economy, the percentage of self-employed people has risen. But in order to produce commodities yourself, you have to have access to tools, materials, a work area. We call all of these things means of production. In a capitalist society, a small amount of people, capitalists, own the vast majority of the means of production. Thus, workers have no choice but to sell their labor power for a wage to a capitalist. This has caused some people to refer to wage labor as wage slavery. And this didn't just happen by accident one day. The process by which simple commodity producers, farmers, craftsmen, etc., were deprived of their means of production so that they had to work as wage laborers was a long and violent process. It demolished communities, destroyed cultures, eroded feudalism, etc. This process, accomplished by dispossessions, outright theft, and usury, is often referred to as primitive accumulation, to differentiate it from the capitalist accumulation it made possible. Along with the profits of merchant capital and usury, primitive accumulation provided the money and capital needed to deprive most of the world of their means to produce and concentrate these means of production as private property in the hands of a relatively small class of people, the capitalist class. This then is what capitalism is, the process of circulating money into commodities into more money with the aid of wage labor and therefore exploitation in order to make a profit for a small class of people, the capitalist class.
Well, I hope that, I found this conversation very useful, but I wonder when I edit this together how easy it's going to be. That is, right there, the fact that I have to wonder, well, is my audience even going to really know what the hell we've been talking about for an hour, is part of the problem. But one other thing, though, that I think, and I think we may be done, but one other thing that I think is a problem for academics and intellectuals about Marx's value theory is that it does have something tangible and real at its core. That what people, the post-structuralists came along, and what academics are really reluctant to embrace now is anything that seems to be like a meta term, or anything that is the center of our society. So everything's pluralist, and there is no system. Now the problem with that is the system that we actually do have can't even be evaluated if you've thrown out all the tools to even make a critique at that point. But I wonder I've been reading a lot of Zizek, so I wonder if something like an ideological critique that Zizek is putting forward might go hand in hand with this economic critique and and help those two things, basically help the economics go down more easily, and also maybe shed some light on what value theory really is about. Because I think ultimately what we're producing is a fiction. This capitalist value, this exploitation, labor that's produced through exploiting labor. It itself is an abstraction, right? Mm-hmm. And so what it's covering up, I think it's the ultimate ideological substance is value in a capitalist system. And I'll even go so far as to talk about it as correlating to it's where God went after we killed him. Is into our own labor, but as a
no, I think that makes sense. That's why Marx, when Marx talks about the fetishism of commodities, he's using a religious metaphor, right? Fetishism was when religion was when people attributed to objects their own powers, Something would happen due to human action, like you win a battle and you say, oh, it's because the Ark of the Covenant allowed us to live, right? And now, we do the same thing in capitalist society. We attribute money and commodities, and we attribute to them all sorts of human powers, like value, which is purely something created by humans, but we attribute it to be an innate product of an object.
Right.
And hence, it becomes the religion of capitalism, this fetishism.
And this is maybe another reason why economists like Kliman have a hard time communicating. It's because when you have that kind of realization, like that there's something of a religious quality to capitalism, for someone to come along and say, let me give you the numbers, the hard facts, it's a little counterintuitive for there to be a way to measure something that's really a religious category.
Well, that's the weird thing about the fetishism argument from Marx is that he says that the fetish is real,
right?
And it doesn't matter if you know it's there or not; it's still real.
Right. And Zizek makes this point all the time with Marx's fetishism. He says, "Oh well, in fact, in everyday life, we don't think of commodities as having mystical properties. They do that for us.
Right.
We think of them as natural products,
right?
And just as the products of our own labor.
Yeah.
It's only the economy where the mystification actually occurs.
Right.
So then, and if you start to think about that too deeply, without the assistance of medicinals, you can get a little bit of a headache. But yeah, no, I do think that bringing that part of the story forward with people, and hand in hand with communicating the labor theory of value and Marx's value theory, might help, especially with certain audiences that are resistant to to capitalism's just its aesthetic itself. I mean, one of the things about Andrew Kliman is listening to him talk is not very different from listening to a neoclassical economist talk. And it's not in its content. It's totally different in its content, but in its style, In
the sense that there's charts and graphs and numbers and...
Yeah, and it's all about things. There's no human...
Right.
There's no fleshiness to it.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that there's a lot of... I mean, this is one of the problems when you have such a small amount of people working in a field, is that you don't have space for the popularizers and the real, academics to all have like a share. It's like...
Yeah, I wouldn't ask Kliman to do anything different than he's doing. I think he's doing a great job. I feel like maybe my task is to try to do what I just described to you. I don't know. But
that's sort of what I feel like my project is about. I don't have any illusions of being some brilliant theorist, but I would like to help get figure out how to communicate some of those ideas in more human terms eventually.
Right.
Sometimes I think I get too caught up in the details and forget about the accessibility of the content, but I try.
Right. Yeah, that's what Diet Soap is all about, is trying to take whatever theory that I'm interested in and present it to people in an accessible way. I find that if you stick to the For Dummies books, it's easier to popularize.
Yeah.
If you don't have such a great understanding of it to begin with, you don't get
right.
Wolff and the underconsumptionists in general strike me as falling short on having a vision of a better society, the way I was going to ask it was this: how important is it to have a good grasp of value theory and the falling rate of profit in order to even conceptualize a better way of organizing the economy? I happen to believe that it's very important, but it does have all these attendant problems, that we talked about. It's difficult to popularize. It requires that you suck down Marx and actually accept it, and all sorts of things. But in the case of Rick Wolff, maybe we could see this as a great illustration of some of its limits. He's very hard on Keynesians, but when I listen to him, he seems to me to be envisioning a future different economy that really remains within the realm of capitalism. Am I wrong there?
No, I would agree with you, and I think it comes from so basically, if you watch his video, Capitalism Hits the Fan, at the very end of the video, he talks about some worker-owned computer software firm in Silicon Valley where the people run their own software firm and get to wear Bermuda shirts and do yoga before work and smoke dope sometimes. And it's like, and he calls this this is Marx's vision of a communist society, he claims. The fact that workers get to wear Bermuda shirts. And I think
they're all shareholders in the company. They all have equal say over what they produce.
And this is sort of a basic the basic idea of market socialism is that we would just have a market society, but there would be no capitalist class in the market society. And so all these problems that we think of as being capitalist problems would be disappeared with. And my critique of that would be that this is sort of a narrow take on what Marx's critique of capitalism is. And that he's not just talking about capitalists and workers, he's also talking about the commodity itself, and the way the commodity itself is the secret to understanding all these different contradictions we have in society. Part of which is seeing the capitalists and workers as embodying another relationship, as sort of being a different side or a different way of looking at the relationship between workers and their own alienated product. I mean, after all, the capitalists are just they're not. It's not their subjective evil intentions that's making them exploit workers, right? It's their the fact that they're fulfilling economic roles. They're taking the role. They're the ones in charge of making sure a firm is competitive, makes a profit, and grows in order to survive. Without a capitalist, workers in a co-op have to do the same thing. They have to make sure their firm profits and that it stays competitive and that it grows. Mm-hmm. And this often involves them making all the same choices a capitalist would make. They're just making the choices collectively instead of an authoritarian way.
Right.
And it makes you, thinking about it that way, makes you realize you need to question a little more than just sort of the very easy capitalist workers antagonism, sort of cartoon picture of Marxism. Take a step back and look a little more at all the ways in which these economic incentives are imposed upon us through the market itself, not just the interpersonal capitalist-worker relationship.
Right, right. And the other thing is that if you believe like I do that the falling rate of profits is responsible for the crisis, his future communist society would go into crisis just like capitalism does.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Most of the features that you would associate with capitalism would still be there. People, it doesn't necessarily mean they'd have to work less, or that they would make more money, or that they would not have crises, that they wouldn't be alienated.
Right. And the reason they would be is because as workers, even self-managed workers, they have to exploit themselves just to grow in a capitalist system and compete.
Right.
They don't have to be Mr. Moneybags. There's no one who's, driving around in a limo or whatever. But regardless, the institution itself has its own demands for profit.
Right.
And so you cannot pay yourself what your labor is worth under capitalism. You just can't. If you were to do that, then you're going to have to move to a different kind of way of organizing, and that includes challenging the market itself as the engine of production. But see, there's where you get really tough, because there's where the real problem starts to loom. I think what a lot of people want to do is say, "Oh, if we can just be nicer, or if we could just get more equality, then we'd find a way out." The problem is somehow a moral problem. But the reality is that when you start to think about what it would take to get to a new kind of economy, there's a big black hole there. It's very difficult to conceive of what the world would look like, if it wasn't set up for exchange in a market. We don't even I can't envision it. And
right.
And I don't think Rick Wolff can either, frankly.
Yeah. I don't think he's really interested in it, actually. I think has his own political orientation that's a lot less radical, I think, than Andrew Kliman's orientation. And so I think you're right. This is a case where, look, we need theory. These people are not just doing things to amuse themselves or to, play who's right. They're doing these things because they think that they're really crucial parts of a potential movement. Unfortunately, they're kind of ahead of the rest of the world, right? Because there's no movement ready for like the theoreticians. Right. Ideally, we don't know how long this crisis will go on, but ideally, people will react to the degradation of this crisis and form strategies, demands, groupings, and at some point there will be a need for theory. Like that's, I guess, the hope if you're a theoretician. Right. And hopefully that theory will inform those practices in theory will inform each other, and they will develop some sort of back and forth and a coevolution that would lead to a real revolutionary situation. But at the moment, I think the theoreticians are lacking from the fact that there's not a lot of feedback from any movement, and the movement's way behind. It's not even ready for any theory at this point.
Oh, I think it's getting better on that front. I think there's still... I mean, look, the fact that Zizek is such a popular figure means that on some level or another there's a hunger for theory.
Yes, I think there is definitely a hunger for it. But I don't think there's any sort of actual movement. There's like individuals who are interested. Yeah. But there aren't like organizations. They're not like, there's no giant union movement or other things we had in the Great Depression that... sort of things that you could look for, hopefully, as a leftist.
We're trying to fight against corporate greed.
This is an opportunity maybe for a new style.
I was waiting for this to happen. I knew it would happen.
Wall Street has destroyed this country's economy and ruined millions of people's lives.
They call it Occupy Wall Street.
And if they don't find some jobs for kids, they're going to have a problem like they had in Tunisia and Egypt.
We're the people, we're the 99%. We're going to make a better world.
The movement has been growing more intense.
We are taking on corporate greed and the powers that oppress us.
Occupy Wall Street passes day 14.
The message that's being sent is enough.
Occupy Wall Street has inspired similar movements in other cities, including Boston, Los Angeles, San Francisco.
We're here at Occupy LA.
The group Occupy Boston here at Dewey Square.
Occupy DC.
To see it externalized in the outside world.
We are united, we are joyful, and we want you to join us.
Well, that just about wraps up the 121st episode of Diet Soap. I want to thank Brendan Cooney for coming back onto the show, and I hope to talk to him again. His blog, Capitalism 101, features his script for the 8th video in the Law of Value series. And I think that's an important subject. I'm going to put a link to that in the show notes. The Law of Value 8 is entitled Subject-Object. And that duality is a big problem, not just for Marxist economics, but for Western philosophy. And I'm excited to get to read this dualism be explored from a different perspective than what is, for me, the usual Philip K. Dick or epistemological perspective. The music and sounds this week included more from Tosca Tango from the movie Waking Life. The human microphone at Occupy Wall Street chanted the words of my hero Slavoj Žižek. Brendan Cooney's YouTube video What is Capitalism was featured. Arturo Toscanini conducted the Internationale. And you heard an advertisement for Occupy Wall Street. Right now you're hearing Shostakovich's Second Waltz. But in just a moment, you'll be listening to Miriam with another Titanic factoid.
Captain Stanley Lord of the steamer Californian, hero or villain? Well, Captain Stanley Lord was the captain of the Californian, which was possibly a ship that the Titanic saw from a distance as she was sinking. And there are two factions called the Lordites and the anti-Lordites. No one knows if, in fact, the Californian was that ship, and if the Californian had the opportunity to go to the rescue of the Titanic, but it seems very possible that it might have. Quoting from The Complete Titanic by Stephen Spignesi, "We know now that Captain Lord was an autocratic, arrogant despot, and that his own crew feared him enough that they would go out of their way to avoid conflicts with the man. After decades of research and study, most Titanic authorities today believe that the Californian was indeed the mystery ship seen by passengers of the Titanic that night. That the crew of the Californian did see Titanic's 8 distress rockets, that Captain Lord consciously refused to go to the aid of the stricken vessel, and that the Californian's log may have been altered to reflect Lord's version of the story. The debate over Captain Lord's role and culpability in the death of over 1,500 Titanic souls will never end. There are too many people on both sides of the Atlantic who refuse to believe that Lord was capable of such cold-hearted behavior." He did defend himself at the U.S. Senate Titanic hearing, and transcripts of this are available, and people could make their own assessment of whether he was guilty or not.